Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. What we're going to show you today is how to replace the bushings on your front differential support mounts. It's these things right here. This is the passenger side, this is the driver's side. And the bushings that go inside these arms are not available through Toyota. Until recently, nobody made an aftermarket bushing for these. If the bushings went bad, you would be forced to replace the whole arm. And from Toyota, these arms cost $145 a piece retail. Online pricing is about $105. You would spend anywhere from $210 to $290 for a set of these support arms. The guy that did us all a favor and decided to start manufacturing these is our buddy Curtis, who owns the Durobumps company. We installed his bump stops on our rigs. He came up with his own design for this bushing. Now you might be wondering, why would I be replacing these bushings? What's going to be the consequences of having worn out front differential mount bushings? Number one, if you have a lot of movement in that front differential, that could be putting a strain on your CV axles, especially as you're four-wheeling and going over uneven terrain. That differential is going to be able to move around a lot because the front supports are really the supports that are holding that differential steady. There is a rear mount, but that rear mount is not really doing a whole lot other than connecting it in the rear. The front two mounts are what's really holding that differential steady on the front of your rig. The other thing that you might be noticing is that you have some type of front end vibration. You can imagine if these bushings for these support arms are really sloppy and worn out, it could allow the whole front differential to move around a lot. And especially at speed, you might notice a front end vibration that you can't really figure out what the cause is. You might think it's maybe your lower control arm bushings. This could be another reason why you have a really bad front end vibration due to worn out bushings. With rigs that are getting much older now, 20 plus years old, rubber bushings aren't going to last forever. What happens is the rubber will degrade over time just from age. Another thing that can attack these bushings is contaminants from radiator coolant, from engine oil. Those do a number on rubber and it breaks down the rubber and then the bushings will fail. So Curtis, with his Durobump company, came up with this design for a replacement bushing. It's different in the respect that it doesn't have voids built into it to allow for the bushing to move. This Toyota bushing builds these voids in it. You can see the little void right there. And this allows for the bushing to move a little bit because Toyota just uses one type of rubber, a very stiff rubber. And so they built the voids into it so it can move a little bit and give the front differential a little bit of movement, because you don't want it super solid and stiff. You want a little bit of give. So what Curtis did is he made a solid bushing, but he just made the rubber compound just a little bit softer than the Toyota rubber, which allows for the give you want in the bushing. So it accomplishes the same thing, just with a little bit less stiff rubber. Mated up with the OEM bushing is this top insulator. This top insulator is available from Toyota. If you found that this insulator was in really bad shape, say some engine oil got to it and really broke it down, or some coolant really got to it and broke it down, or maybe just time got to it and this rubber's really broken down, you can pick these up from Toyota and they go for about 10 bucks a piece online pricing. So we'll put a link in the video description to these insulators if you wanted to replace these while you're getting your replacement bushings in. This would be the opportune time to do it. What makes up this bushing is a metal sleeve and then the rubber itself that has a metal sleeve in the middle of it. We're not replacing the metal sleeve that gets pressed into this arm. We're only replacing the rubber portion of it. The rubber Durobump bushing is going to replace this part only, not the metal sleeve. We're going to show you a technique where we heat this arm up to where we can separate the rubber from the sleeve and easily push the bushing out. The way we're gonna get ready for this job is we're gonna get the front end jacked up, and the only reason for that is just to give us a little bit more room to work. You technically could do this without lifting the front end of your vehicle up, but it's just gonna be a little bit harder to get underneath the rig and get the job done. We're gonna have my truck up on ramps with the rear tires chocked so the vehicle can't roll anywhere. And then we're going to get the skid plates out of our way, because the skid plates are going to be covering the area we need to get to access these arms. All right, so let's get started with this job. Now that we have the skid plates out of our way, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to break free the 19mm bolts that hold the support arm to the differential. What I have is a big 1/2-inch drive ratchet. This is actually a flex head ratchet from Gear Wrench, and I have a 19mm short socket. The driver's side bracket has 3 bolts holding it on. These first 2 are fairly easy to get to. The top one is going to require a medium length extension to get to. These bolts have a fairly high torque value, so you're going to have to use some of your man strength to break them loose. But if the ratchet you have isn't going to be good enough, get a little bit more mechanical advantage and get a longer breaker bar so it's easier to break them free. The bottom 2 are now finger tight, and now I'm going to put a medium length extension on this one to break this one free. So the extension that I found is going to work is about a 5-inch extension. All 3 bolts that hold the bracket onto the differential are loose, and now we're going to work on the other side. Here's the passenger side, and you can see that this bracket only has 2 bolts holding it onto the differential, and these are easier to get to. No extension is needed. That one's loose, and this one's loose. The reason why we broke these free first is because if we take these 19mm bolts that go through the cross member first, then the whole differential is going to be flopping around, and we're not going to have enough stability to break free the bolts that hold the brackets onto the differential. Now we're going to zip these bolts out. I'm going to use my impact gun on this side, and then on top I'm going to use a long 19mm box end wrench to hold the 19mm nut on top of the cross member still. When you remove these 19mm bolts, you don't have to worry about the differential dropping anywhere, because there is a rear mount holding the differential to a cross member, and then you also have the CV shafts installed, not letting the differential go anywhere also. So you see you got the big long bolt that goes through the cross member. This washer comes off, and this is what was up top, this 19mm flange nut. One thing that you have to be careful with the wrench on top of the cross member holding the 19mm nut is that when you're applying force and maybe it's really tight, the wrench can move on you, and it could either hit your oil pan or it could potentially hit a transmission cooler line. You just want to be careful that the wrench doesn't turn and damage something. So now we're going to get this passenger side bolt out. Now that you have this one loose, you saw that the whole assembly dropped a little bit, and that's okay, because like I said, the rear mount is holding the differential in place. Also, the CV shafts are holding it. And here's a look at the size box end wrench I have. I have a long 19mm gear wrench. And now I'm just gonna take these out with my fingers. If you're dealing with corrosion, if you live in one of the rust belts of the country, you're probably gonna have to maybe ratchet this out the whole way, but this thing is actually just coming out with my fingers. Okay, so the passenger side bracket is completely off now. Now we're getting the bolts out that hold the driver's side bracket onto the differential. As you can see, for the very top one, I'm utilizing that same extension that I used to break it free because I can't get my hand in there very well, and I'm just spinning this out. So I got the upper bolt out. Now I'm going to work on the middle one. Okay, the middle one's out. Now we just have to get the last bolt out. Okay, the driver's side bracket is now off. Now we're going to get the bushings out. If these insulators didn't pop off when you pulled the arms off, pop these off. What we're going to do is we're going to apply an even amount of heat around the whole circumference of this arm to heat up the rubber bushing to where we can push it out this side. We're gonna use just a regular old butane torch that you could pick up at any hardware store. Apply heat on this for a decent amount of time, probably 3 to 5 minutes, and get this nice and warmed up to where the bushing starts to sizzle and it's most likely gonna catch fire. With that said, you don't want to do this operation in an enclosed environment because you're going to be giving off a lot of nasty smoke that's not good for you. So don't do it in your garage, do it in the open air. So right now we're in my driveway. I have a piece of plywood that's going to be protecting my driveway from getting any dripping rubber to get stuck onto my driveway. Now if you're wondering, hey, doesn't wood burn? Well, yeah, of course wood burns, but I'm not too worried about the wood catching fire out here. If it catches fire, we could just stamp it out or put a rag over it to take the oxygen away and put the fire out. Ideally, if I had a big metal pan like you would put underneath your car for keeping oil from dripping on your driveway, that would be ideal, a metal pan, but I don't have a metal pan. I'm just protecting my driveway from the drippings with a piece of plywood. Since I'm gonna be applying heat to here, through the process of conduction, this thing is gonna get a little hot, even with me grabbing it way down here. So I'm gonna wear some gloves to protect my hands. So I'm gonna get my torch started. Here we go. I'm gonna see if that was enough. I have a long screwdriver. I'm gonna see if I can push the bushing through. It needs some more. I'm gonna give it another shot. As you just saw, once I got it hot enough, I was able to get this long screwdriver in against the sleeve and just wiggle it a little bit with some pressure this direction, and I was able to pop it out. So now you can see the whole rubber bushing is right there. Now what the directions say is if there's any leftover residue of rubber, just take the torch on the inside and just heat it up, and then you could just get the rest of the residual rubber out. Looking at this, it looks pretty darn clean. So there's just a little bit of rubber right here, but I think my job is done. What you'll notice is that this side of the arm on the inner diameter is the harder section to get heated evenly because you have this section of the arm in the way. So I was actually putting the flame right in on both sides in order to get this side hot enough to where the rubber would separate from the sleeve. This is the bushing we just got done burning out. And right here, these are the voids that we talked about at the beginning of the video of how Toyota makes these to allow for a little bit more give because they just use one type of rubber, a very stiff rubber. So they build these voids here to allow for the movement. Before we take this bushing out, let us show you the kind of movement that these bushings currently have. And you could see how those voids allow for the bushing to move. I'm not applying very much force at all, so I don't know if this is the way the bushing's supposed to be or are these bushings worn out. I would probably have to guess that these bushings are a little bit worn out because I'm barely putting any pressure and this thing's moving very easily. So now we're going to use the same technique and burn the bushing out of this arm. Okay, I think I've got it hot enough. Again, I'm gonna use my screwdriver. I'm gonna push through from this side. Support the arm against what you have and just look at that. Easy peasy, it's out. Just like Curtis says in his instructions, some of the signs that you'll know that you got the arm hot enough is, number one, you're gonna hear that snap, crackle, pop. Like if you're eating some Rice Krispies and you just poured milk into your Rice Krispies, you're hearing the rubber crackling, letting you know that there's starting to be some separation from the metal sleeve. Another thing is that everything has an ignition temperature, basically the temperature at which it will start to combust. And as you noticed in both of the bushings, they finally got to a temperature that they started to burn. And that's another telltale sign that you finally have the arm hot enough to where the bushing will just slide out really easily. While the arm is still hot, with the gloved hand, get in there with the rag and wipe out any of the rubber residue. If you find that there's still some residue in there, you can get the torch in there and heat it up a little bit more to basically to where you can just wipe it out. After you've let the arms cool enough to where they're cold to the touch, I cleaned up the inside of this diameter with some brake cleaner just to get it a little bit cleaner for the install of the new bushings. These bushings that Durobump makes is a nice tight fit. So you need something to lubricate the bushing to where it will slide into the arm easy. Curtis recommends using two different things. Number one, you can use some dishwashing soap. And another thing he recommends as an option to lubricate the bushing is some hairspray like Aquanet. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of dishwashing soap on here. I'm gonna spread it with my finger. This bushing could only go in one way. It's got to go in this way. Let me see if I could slide this in just with my hand. I'm just wiggling it back and forth. And it seems like I got to a spot where it's not going in very easily anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this washer that goes here, and I'm going to use a channel locks and squeeze it. So the washer is protecting the bushing from the jaws of the channel locks, and I'm going to slowly work it in there. You just got to keep on working it around the edge and get it in there. You just saw us utilizing a pair of channel locks and using the washer to protect the bushing to slowly squeeze this bushing in place. And we found it was a little bit tedious, but doable. But now we're going to try a different technique of using a bench vise to press the bushing into the arm. So the same thing, we're just going to use some dishwashing soap. This time I'm actually going to put a little bit on the inside diameter of the arm as well as the bushing. Okay, we're going to slide the bushing into the arm, get it started as far as we can with our hand. Wow, look at that. This one installed without any force at all. Interesting. We're thinking that lubricating both sides allowed this bushing to slip in a lot easier. On the first one, I just lubricated the bushing itself, and there was still a lot of friction. I think the key is lubricate the inside diameter of the arm, also put some dish washing soap on the bushing too, and then slide it in. What we were going to show you is with the washer protecting the bushing, you can get a socket. This is a 28mm impact socket. You could get this on the back side so this sleeve has somewhere to go, and then you could clamp it in your bench vise. Then you could perform the same operation that you did with the channel locks by just turning the jaws together, pushing the bushing in. If you found that the bushing wouldn't slide in with just hand strength from the lubrication, then you could do it this way too. We're going to get the passenger side bracket in first. So reversing our procedure, I'm going to get the arm attached to the differential tube first on the passenger side. To make insertion of these bolts easier, what I did do is I cleaned these up with some brake cleaner, and then I took a brass brush just to clean the threads up really nice so everything would thread together easier. Okay, I'm just going to keep those hand tight. Now I'm going to get the driver's side bracket in place. Now we're gonna get the long bolts in place. You have to remember a couple things. Number one, you wanna get this insulator on top of the bushing so it goes in this direction with this side facing the mount and this side facing the cross member. So you slide that over the end of the sleeve and get it in place. Now you got to get your bolt with the big washer in through the bottom. It's pretty clear how this goes. This concave side faces the bolt head. You slide it up through the cross member and then you reach on top and get your 19mm nut started. In order to get the nut started, you're just gonna have to push up with a little bit of strength to get the differential up a little bit where the threads of the bolt will be sticking out the top of the cross member. And I did the same with the passenger side. We're gonna torque these to spec. The torque spec for these long bolts is 101 foot-pounds. Before I get the torque wrench on there, I'm just gonna use a ratchet to cinch these up firm. I have the 19mm box end wrench on the top holding the nuts steady, and then now that's pretty firm. And I'm gonna do the same with the other side. Okay, both sides are firmed up, and now I'm gonna transition to the torque wrench. Okay, 101 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna torque the bolts that attach the mount to the differential. The torque spec for these bolts is 116 foot-pounds. Because my torque wrench is pretty long and my truck is only jacked up so far, I could only turn the wrench just a little bit, maybe one click at a time. But there it is, 116. And then we're gonna do the same thing with the other two bolts on this driver's side. Now we're torquing the passenger side bracket. Okay, and the second one is torqued to 116. After you've torqued everything to spec, you're basically done. The last thing you got to do is just get your skid plates in place. The key to getting these bushings out really easily and really clean is to use the right amount of heat. You have to heat up that arm evenly till you start hearing that snap, crackle, pop. You'll finally see that the rubber catches fire, letting you also know that it's probably pretty darn close to the right temperature. Then you just use the big screwdriver, pushing from this direction, and just push the bushing right out. We did do this on another occasion, and we made the mistake of not heating up the arm enough, and then we were sitting here prying on the bushing and making the job much harder for ourselves. So heat up the arm really evenly and hot enough to where this sucker will just come right out. If you get the screwdriver in there and you find out that it's fighting you, that means it's not hot enough yet. Put the screwdriver down, go back to the torch, and continue to heat that arm up evenly, and then you'll finally get it to the point where just a little bit of pressure with the screwdriver will knock this thing out. Another thing we learned is that getting it in, you're best off putting a little bit of dishwashing soap on the inside of the arm as well as the outside of the bushing. So everything is really slippery and you could just push that bushing in place. But if you found that it is fighting you a little bit, you could do the channel lock technique or you could use the bench vise technique. Either technique is fine. Just remember that you want to protect the bushing. You don't want anything like the serrated jaws of a channel locks digging into the bushing and damaging it. What you'll most likely notice on your rig is that the driver's side bushing is more than likely going to be the one that's a little bit more torn apart. The reason for that is that when you perform an oil change, when you're taking the oil filter out in that direction towards that driver's side support arm, you're most likely going to drip a little bit of engine oil. With these support arms being a low point on the undercarriage, this bushing is basically in a collection point for fluids. If oil drips onto the top of this, it's going to work its way into the bushing and potentially make it break down prematurely. Another thing that we forgot to mention with this OEM bushing design is because of these voids, this will allow contaminants like gear oil and engine oil and radiator coolant to get into these voids and start working on the bushing to break it down. So that's another positive benefit of the Durobump bushing being a solid bushing, it doesn't allow any voids for those contaminants to get in and sit in there and work on the bushing. Sean and I are in agreement that it was really cool that Curtis with his Durobump company made some bushings for us, because it is a huge savings. So instead of having to go to Toyota and buying whole arms, you could just get the bushings from Durobumps, burn out the OEM bushing, get the Durobump bushing in, and save yourself a decent amount of money. So how can you get yourself a set of these Durobumps? We're gonna put a link in the video description to the Durobump website so you can purchase them. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We'll be back with more videos. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye and sick mads.